Hello and welcome to another car review on the desert road. Now, we've been getting requests from some of our viewers to focus a little bit more on the used car market. Not every car purchase is a new car, they say. Why don't you guys include some cult classics, some fan favorites, something like this.
Yes, this is a 2003 Hummer H2. It's big, it's yellow, and well, most people have a very controversial opinion about it.
So for example, let's say you're driving this down your typical street. You pass by other cars, you pass by people walking their dogs, sitting at a cafe, drinking a cup of coffee, and you can't help be a little bit confused by their reactions.
Some people see this honking SUV next to them and immediately begin to make assumptions. Some see the driver as a middle-aged dad going through a midlife crisis. Others see someone who cares very little about the environment and wants to see all the polar bears become extinct.
Because of these varying opinions, you get a wide array of reactions from people. Everything from smiles and thumbs ups to middle fingers and people trying to spit at you. No, really, a guy tried to spit at me while we were both parked at a red light. So that really begs the question, is the Hummer really as bad as some people seem to think it is? Now, to answer this question, we need to take a step back and really think about what this car represents and why it was built. Now, the Hummer brand came onto the scene in 1992. Originally developed as a military vehicle, it was quickly released to the general public due to popular demand. So then, 11 years later, Hummer, now under the ownership of General Motors, decided to release a successor to the H1, fittingly called the Hummer H2. Now, this was designed to be a bit more of a mundane SUV, something that still retained the look and feel of the original hardcore Hummer H1, but something you didn't necessarily want to blow up with a rocket launcher the second your wife asked you to run to the store to buy her some milk. Therefore, of course, compromises had to be made.
For starters, the chassis of this H2 sits on a modified version of their 2003 GMC Sierra 2500 pickup truck. The engine, also not very unique, was the LQ4 pushrod V8, a derivative of which could be found in basically every single GM SUV or pickup truck from the early to late 2000s. It, of course, didn't help that the body had to be designed to look like a modernized version of everyone's beloved Hummer H1, which of course added weight.
For example, look at this hood. It's preposterously heavy. Oh gosh. How do they do that? How'd they make this so heavy? All of this then combined to give this car a curb weight of over 6,500 pounds. That's like taking a Chevy Suburban and putting an elephant on top of it.
The performance, therefore, was absolutely abysmal. The weight combined with an engine making only 316 horsepower and 360 pound-feet of torque gave a horrendous 0 to 60 time of 10.7 seconds and 17.6 seconds through the quarter mile. Well, at least according to a car and driver test back when this car was new. Not really a fast car then, is it?
Likewise, for being such a large vehicle, you'd think there would be an overabundance of space in the rear trunk. Well, think again. You see, when I opened the rear hatch, what GM decided to do, instead of giving you usable space for groceries or luggage, instead, they decided to put the spare tire on the entire left-hand side of the trunk, and then oddly enough, a sixth seat on the right-hand side. Odd. Now, you might be thinking, well, this is a six-person vehicle then. Well, not quite, because you see the third row seat, the sixth one back here, it's bolted directly to the trunk. And what Hummer failed to do was provide a cutout for your legs. So essentially, the only way a human is fitting in the back third row, sixth seat is, well, if they don't have any legs. And of course, we can't forget the biggest glaring red flag in the room, the absolutely horrendous fuel economy. Now, don't even think about saving for retirement, because as soon as this H2 sees even a single green bill in your wallet, it's going to slurp down so much gas, you're going to be begging your manager for extended hours and overtime shifts. Good job then, Hummer. Very well done indeed.
So, at this point, you're probably telling yourself, wow, GM and Hummer really screwed the pooch on this one. Well, you see, I don't think the answer is quite that simple.
Sure, perhaps this car was a flop when it was new, and the market didn't quite understand what GM was doing with Hummer. But if you fast forward to 2022, it begs the question, is this car still a flop?
With vehicles such as the new Ford Bronco, Land Rover Defender, Ram TRX, and staples such as the Ford Raptor and Jeep Wrangler, the typical car buyer in the US has plenty of options to choose from for their off-roading needs.
So why should someone throw all of those aside and buy a 20-year-old slow, bulky, lugging Hummer with poor fuel economy that's going to make you want to open up a second mortgage on the house because you can't afford the gas bill? Well, put simply, it's because it's the best. Now, to break things down into a bit more of a digestible fashion, what do all these trucks and SUVs all have in common? Well, for starters, they all invoke this old school philosophy of design, harking back to days long gone. For example, the new Ford Bronco. Its design was inspired by the 1970s Bronco model. The Jeep, for example, it still can be easily related to the 1940s military vehicle. And FYI, it's actually one of the best-selling SUVs of all time. And then the new Defender, well, that's just hit or miss depending on who you ask. The Hummer then, in my opinion, I think does the design the best. Sure, it could be a little plasticky here and there, and sure, it might be a little too big, but there's no mistaking what a Hummer H2 is on the road for any other car. It was doing what the SUVs of today are doing before it was cool. If anything, this thing was 20 years ahead of its game. This is what essentially sparked the retro SUV craze. And then there's the interior. Now, sure, it's a bit plasticky, classic GM plastic door panels and dash. But there's no denying this invokes this sense of ruggedness, this sense of off-roady, dirt road feels. Something akin, honestly, to an Arnold Schwarzenegger action movie, I would say. And then there are these seats. Now, I urge you to try to find something on sale today that's as soft or as comfortable as these lazy boys. Honestly, taking a road trip in this car is basically like going to your favorite massage parlor, getting a rub down, head to toe, with your favorite smelling olive oil.
And then, it's not like this is a bare bones interior either. You have heated seats, automatic climate control, Bose audio speakers. Sure, the original radio was no good, but nearly every single H2 has been retrofitted with some kind of touchscreen audio system with either Apple CarPlay or Android Auto, or both.
Now, all of this is fine and dandy, but how does the car ride? Well, the answer is actually pretty good. You see, when you combine the weight of this car with the auto-leveling suspension in the back, it kind of makes it just glide right over the road in a similar fashion to what I would assume a semi-truck does when it's bombarding cross-country down the interstate. Sure, the ride quality can't compare to that of a Rolls-Royce, but it rides far, far closer to the soft ride of a Cadillac Escalade than it does to the rough and tumble ride of a Jeep Wrangler. And it's actually got really great visibility too. Now let's talk about size. People think Hummer and they think an absolute whale of a car, something that's not going to fit into a lane. But in reality, by modern standards, this car isn't actually quite that big. When compared to a 2022 Ram TRX, this car is actually quite dainty and petite. It's 7 inches narrower and 3.5 feet shorter. 3.5 feet. That's like my entire lower body, legs down. It's mad.
So to recap, we figured out that the Hummer has a beautiful design, its suspension is comfortable, its seats are like sofas, it's got all the tech you would ever need, and it's not quite as big as you might have thought.
So what about the whole off-roading bit? Well, honestly, it does that pretty good too. Sure, it's not as robust as a Jeep Wrangler or as fast as a Ford Raptor or a Ram TRX, but you tell this thing to try a similar trail as any of those trucks, and I guarantee you, stock for stock, it's going to succeed 99% of the time. Now, this truck has 10 whole inches of ground clearance with a 40-degree angle of approach and departure. Honestly, for a luxury grocery getter from 2003, that's simply unheard of. And of course, this has nothing to say about its aftermarket community. Now, sure, it might not be as popular as Jeep, but trust me when I say the H2 off-roading aftermarket community is high and large. They're trying to find everything from making this thing have higher ground clearance, bigger suspension, bigger tires, as well as adding more power. And speaking of adding more power, the engine in this car, as mentioned earlier, is the LQ4, which was abundant in basically everything GM made from the early to late 2000s. And because of that, this car is reliable. This engine, with just routine basic maintenance, should easily last 300,000 miles. And of course, if it does break, it's easy to find a replacement because it was so prevalent. Honestly, for the price of doing like a rod bearing job on a BMW, you could probably buy an LQ4 engine, replace it, and then buy a backup one to have in case the first replacement breaks. Honestly, it's pretty remarkable how easily parts are available for this car.
So it's also a great daily driver, it can fit 5 adults comfortably, it's reliable, there's plenty of aftermarket support for the car, and it's better than an average run-of-the-mill Chevy Tahoe or Ford Explorer at off-roading. And all of this can be had in near pristine condition for about $20,000 to $25,000. So why do so many people hate it?
Well, I think it's marketing and word of mouth. When the Hummer H2 came out, people had this expectation that Hummer was building a car that could scale Mount Everest, without actually thinking of the implications a car that could scale Mount Everest might have. Instead, what GM and Hummer decided was to build a usable car, something that you could take to the grocery store to buy your wife some milk, or take your kids to school, or take your family on a nice holiday to the coast, while still maintaining that off-road capability. What Hummer did then was build a car not that people wanted, but a car that people actually needed. You see, people love to praise the new Ram TRX for being a fast off-road truck, but fail to mention the fact that it gets very poor fuel economy, actually very similar to the H2. People love to praise the Jeep Wrangler for being a very capable off-road and heavily moddable SUV, but fail to mention the fact that its on-road ride quality is absolutely horrendous. Of course, a lot of people say the Hummer H2 is slow, but then again, it didn't stop anyone from buying the brand new Toyota Prius, which the Hummer is actually faster than. You know, when you look at a car, it's easy to look at its flaws and just kind of gloss over it and call it a bad car. But when actually looking at a car, you got to look at it as a whole to really understand why the car was built.
And maybe that's the whole point. Every car has pros and cons, and no car is perfect. But when you really get down to it, there's one thing that truly separates this car from the rest. Somehow, through various different sheets of metal and plastic and design decisions, the one thing that transcended across from the H1 to the H2 was its soul.
And with that, until next time on the Desert Road.